Before he was the general, before he was the president, George Washington was just a 22-year-old lieutenant colonel who walked blindly into disaster. This wasn't a tactical maneuver. This was a fatal misstep in the wilderness, one that would become the critical and definitive opening action of the French and Indian War. The small engagement fought on July 3, 1754, the Battle of Fort Necessity, was the spark that ignited the largest fire the world had ever seen. Why did this tiny, hastily built fort in a low-lying, marshy field in Pennsylvania matter so much? Because by the mid-18th century, the upper Ohio River Valley territory had become the primary area of contention between Great Britain and France. This vast, rich territory was seen as terra contestata, contested land, where a clash between British, French, and American Indian cultures was absolutely inevitable. The French were aggressively constructing a chain of strategic fortifications to solidify their claims and push the British off the continent entirely. Virginia's Governor Dinwiddie, keenly interested in protecting British settlements and his own investments in the Ohio Company, decided to escalate the conflict. In late 1753, he dispatched a young Washington on a diplomatic mission, carry a letter ordering the French forces to vacate the area. Washington, familiar with the Ohio Valley from surveying work, delivered the ultimatum to the French officers, who politely but firmly refused, even boasting drunkenly that they intended to take the entire valley. The failure of this initial diplomatic effort made armed conflict a near certainty. Washington, driven by ambition and a desperate desire for military glory, returned to the frontier in 1754 with aggressive military orders: secure the forks of the Ohio. His task, issued without permission from the British government in London, was essentially an invitation to start a war. Washington set off from Alexandria, Virginia, with over 130 men, mostly loose, idle persons that are quite destitute in house and home, recruited with promises of 200,000 acres of land. The journey was arduous, with the column traversing only 20 miles in 15 days at one point. Then, disaster struck at the site Washington was supposed to secure. The French had already won the race, driving off a small British crew and building the formidable Fort Duquesne. Washington, a rookie officer who lacked formal British military training and lived in the shadow of his experienced half-brother Lawrence, refused to turn back. Instead, driven by his ambition, he pushed on to a well-known meeting site he called the Great Meadows. This flat, open ground, located about 37 miles south of the Forks, was nestled between two ridges. Washington, viewing the terrain with naive confidence, declared it a charming field for an encounter. He decided to make camp and await reinforcements, having just been promoted to colonel following the death of Colonel Joshua Fry. The stage for Washington's first great defeat was now perfectly set in that seemingly advantageous, yet fatally exposed meadow. The calm at the Great Meadows was violently shattered on May 28, 1754, by the skirmish at Jumonville Glen. This event was the necessary precursor to Fort Necessity, a premeditated act of war orchestrated by Washington. Washington received intelligence from Christopher Gist that a French-Canadian party of about 50 men was lurking nearby. More critically, he received a message from his key native ally, the Mingo chief Tanahurison, known as the Half-King, who had found the French camp. Washington, taking a detachment of 40 men, met with the Half-King, who brought 12 warriors, and together they agreed to attack the Canadians. The French force, consisting of 29 soldiers led by Ensign Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, was ambushed while encamped in a ravine near present-day Hopwood and Farmington, Pennsylvania. The French maintained that Jumonville was not a scout, but a diplomat carrying dispatches, intending merely to deliver a summons demanding the British leave the area, much like the one Washington had delivered months earlier. Washington's force, utilizing the cover of the high ground, encircled the camp, catching some of the French Canadians while they were still asleep and their arms were stacked. The ensuing chaos lasted only about 15 minutes, ending in a swift British victory. 10 French soldiers were killed and 21 were captured. Washington later wrote in his diary that they killed Mr. de Jumonville, the commander, also 9 others. We wounded 1 and made 21 prisoners. But the skirmish turned into an atrocity immediately following the surrender. As the captive Jumonville was attempting to show his orders, the Half-King ran up to him and, with a tomahawk, split open his skull. Accounts confirm the Half-King then ritually scalped him, declaring in French, "Thou art not yet dead, my father." This act was likely intended by Tanahurison. who had recently lost influence over other tribes, to provoke a full war between the British and French, forcing the tribes back to the British side. Washington, who was completely taken aback by the Indians' war practices, realized that the formal European military actions he had studied bore little resemblance to the chaotic and savage, backwoods fighting of the American wilderness. Yet, having initiated the surprise attack, Washington bore ultimate responsibility for the resulting atrocity in the eyes of the French. The French immediately seized upon this event, framing the attack as the assassination of an emissary and a murder. The death of Jumonville provided the French with a powerful, justifiable pretext for retaliation. Washington, however, wrote his report and framed the event as a justified attack, even famously writing to his brother, "I heard bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." That bravado, however, would soon be tested because the die was cast. One French survivor, Monceau, escaped to Fort Duquesne, carrying the harrowing news of the massacre and ensuring France prepared a massive, vengeful counterattack. The immediate fallout from the bloodshed at Jumonville Glen was the swift, terrible realization that a much larger French force was coming for revenge. Washington knew a massive retaliation was imminent, fueled by Captain Louis Coulon de Villiers, Jumonville's own brother, who was already leading a substantial military force out of Fort Duquesne. Washington quickly withdrew his approximately 400 men to the Great Meadows. The site he had previously boasted was a charming field for an encounter. In a desperate rush to establish a defensible position, Washington oversaw the hasty construction of a fort. The result was Fort Necessity, built between the end of May and the first 3 days of June 1754. However, Washington's leadership decisions proved fundamentally flawed. He was directly responsible for choosing the location, and that choice doomed the entire defense. The fort was a crude circular stockade in an open meadow, later scientifically categorized as a low-lying, wet meadow. Inside, Washington built a small, 14 by 14 log cabin, not as a barracks, but simply to protect perishable supplies like gunpowder, rum, cornmeal, and flour from the elements, a detail that ironically highlights the poor conditions even before the siege began. The soldiers themselves were meant to fight from breastworks outside the palisade, utilizing the natural entrenchments provided by the nearby creek beds. But the critical tactical error was the fort's poor proximity to the surrounding terrain. Effective 18th-century frontier defense required clearing a wide field of fire. Washington, having not the time to perfect the fortifications, left the dense woods intact nearby. The simple palisade was built adjacent to high ground surrounded by dense Appalachian oak forest. The forest edge was a mere 60 to 80 yards away, the maximum effective range of muskets. This meant French and Indian sharpshooters could occupy superior, concealed positions and fire continuously down upon the exposed British defenders. Washington's command was also plagued by acute logistical failures. By early July, many of the colonial troops were sick, exhausted, and desperately hungry. The Virginia militia were described upon their eventual return as half-starved, unpaid, and practically naked. Even with reinforcements, about 100 regular British troops from South Carolina under Captain James Mackay. The command structure was fraught with friction because regular officers held seniority over colonial officers. Washington's attempts to coordinate with his native allies were failing. 2. The Half-King sensed the doomed position and threatened to abandon Washington if he did not retreat farther south. When Washington refused, most of his Indian allies indeed left the camp. On July 1st, following reports of the massive French force advancing from Fort Duquesne, Washington rushed his 400 exhausted men back to Fort Necessity, retreating from Gist's plantation. They spent July 2nd attempting to strengthen the fort by improving the trenches outside the stockade. They were digging in literally, for a massive attack they knew was coming, but Washington admitted he had not the time to perfect the necessary defenses. The result of Washington's site selection and hasty construction was not a fortress, but a muddy bowl of doom, waiting to be filled with the torrential rain that was about to fall. The morning of July 3, 1754, saw the confrontation Washington had desperately tried to prepare for. Captain Louis Coulon de Villiers, driven by a quest to avenge ourselves and chastise them for having violated the most sacred laws of civilized nations, led his force of approximately 700 men toward the Great Meadows. This force was composed of about 600 French soldiers and 100 Indian allies, including warriors from the Abenakis, Hurons, and Ottawas. Washington could only muster about 400 tired, inexperienced men, roughly 300 of whom were healthy enough to fight. When the French approached the fort, Washington initially marched about 50 of his men into the open field in anticipation of a pitched European battle, where the enemy would charge across the open ground. However, the French refused to fight by European rules. They were content to keep to the woods. As the French took up their positions within the surrounding woods, positions that offered natural cover and tactical height, Washington withdrew his British and colonial troops into the hastily improved entrenchments outside the central stockade. The British were now exposed, and their miscalculation was instantly apparent. Then, the torrential weather intervened, playing a devastating role that effectively guaranteed the British defeat. Rain fell persistently throughout the day. This single environmental factor immediately undermined Washington's defense. The already marshy ground of the Great Meadows quickly flooded, filling the inadequate trenches with water. For 18th-century black powder weaponry, wet conditions meant disarmament. The rain soaked the exposed British soldiers' gunpowder, rendering many of their muskets useless for sustained fire. Only 2 screws were available for the entire regiment to clear the wet charges in their muskets. The French and their Native American allies, however, maintained superior, effective fire from the cover of the dry woods, where the forest canopy provided protection. The engagement quickly devolved into sniping. The British defenders were trapped, surrounded by what felt like fire coming from every tree, stump, stone, and bush along the wood line. Casualties mounted quickly among Washington's men, who were easy targets in the open meadow. The French also opened fire on the British livestock, killing most of the cattle and horses, which was a severe blow to the men's morale and supplies. Adding to the chaos, the hard-pressed defenders broke into the rum supply, and soon half the Virginia militia was thoroughly drunk. The fighting continued sporadically until around 8 p.m. Washington's command was collapsing. His muskets were misfiring, his men were drunk or wounded, and they were running low on ammunition. The French, acting as invisible ghosts picking off Virginians, had turned the Great Meadows into a bloody, muddy bowl of doom. By 8 p.m., the British situation was completely untenable. Washington's force had suffered grievously, with 30 men killed and 70 wounded, totaling over 100 casualties. In stark contrast, the French and Indian casualties were minimal, amounting to only 3 killed and 17 wounded, confirming a severe 5-to-1 casualty ratio. Washington and Captain Mackay, facing grim realities, soaked gunpowder, exhausted men, and severed escape routes, understood that their position was hopeless. It was Captain Villiers who called out near midnight, offering a truce to discuss surrender. Washington, initially suspicious of the request, eventually sent 2 men out to negotiate. The British relied on Captain Jacob Van Bram, a Dutch-born officer, to serve as the translator for the surrender documents, which were written in French, a language Washington could not read. Huddled over the water-soaked, mud-smeared documents in the leaky storehouse, Washington and Mackay listened as Van Bram laboriously translated over candlelight. The military terms were surprisingly lenient. The British were allowed to withdraw the next morning with the honors of war, retaining their baggage and weapons. However, they were forced to surrender their swivel guns, and 2 captains, Van Bram and Captain Robert Stobo, were left as hostages to guarantee the return of the French prisoners captured at Jumonville Glen. Washington also had to promise that his men would not return to the Ohio River Valley for 1 year. But Villiers, acting as the avenging brother of the murdered Jumonville, had a decisive diplomatic weapon embedded within the text. He deliberately included a provision that served as a confession. The core of the diplomatic crisis centered on the French word "el assassinat." Washington and Mackay signed the document on July 4th, unknowingly admitting that Washington had ordered the assassination of Jumonville. This was due to a severe mistranslation or oversight by Van Bram, who allegedly rendered the contentious word as merely the death of or the killing of Jumonville. By signing the document, Washington unknowingly and incorrectly confessed to an official act of war, the murder of a foreign diplomat. Washington's signature transformed the military defeat into a foundational geopolitical crisis. The French secured a crushing diplomatic victory and allowed the surviving British forces to depart on the morning of July 4th, carrying their wounded and humiliated. The French then put a torch to Fort Necessity, ensuring the paltry symbol of British strength in the Ohio Valley was burned to the ground. Washington's unwitting signature on the surrender document, admitting to el assassinat, immediately served the French strategic agenda. They swiftly utilized the document, along with Washington's captured journal, as international propaganda to discredit the English. The French portrayed the British as lawless combatants who had authorized the murder of a diplomatic emissary, using the signed confession to level accusations that Washington had ordered Jumonville's slaying. The propaganda argued that Britain had violently disrupted their peaceful occupation of the Ohio Valley. Crucially, the document correctly asserted that Washington was acting under the authority of the British Crown. Thus, the acknowledged assassination of a foreign diplomat by a Crown officer was officially deemed an act of war between Britain and France. This linguistic error, the mistranslation of one word, legally transformed the conflict from a localized frontier dispute over contested territory into an imperial war. Horace Walpole, a British politician, summed up the gravity of the event, writing, "The volley fired by a young Virginian in the backwoods of America set the world on fire." The news of the skirmish and the diplomatic fallout spread rapidly across Europe. France was enraged, and Britain was humiliated, leading to the official escalation of the conflict. The Battle of Fort Necessity marked the ignition point of the war in North America, triggering a chain reaction that spiraled far beyond the Ohio Valley. In response, Britain decided to dispatch General Edward Braddock with a massive expeditionary army to North America the following year, tasked with dislodging the French and capturing Fort Duquesne. This attempt led to the catastrophic Braddock's defeat in 1755, where Braddock was killed and the British suffered heavy losses after repeating Washington's mistake of concentrating troops in the open woods. The French and Indian War quickly escalated. The conflict over control of the Ohio River Valley territory widened into the 7 Years' War, which was fought across the globe: North America, Europe, Africa, India, the Caribbean, and the high seas. The 7 Years' War was the larger, overarching conflict between the French and British. The outbreak of this first truly global conflict was thus directly attributed to the events surrounding Fort Necessity and Washington's unwitting signature of capitulation. The aftermath of Fort Necessity was brutal for Washington's reputation. Upon returning to Virginia, he received a cool reception from Governor Dinwiddie, who criticized his command decisions and hinted that the failure stemmed from a want of proper command. Dinwiddie argued that Washington had acted against orders by attacking before all forces had joined. However, this criticism was largely a political defense mechanism, deflecting attention from the colonial government's systemic failure to adequately provision the militia, who were starving, unpaid, and practically naked. Despite the shame of defeat and the political liability he became, the disaster at Fort Necessity provided George Washington with essential, painful military experience. This small battle forced the young officer to learn crucial lessons that would define his future command style. He learned that the formal, chess-piece military actions he had read about were useless in the American wilderness, and he needed to adapt to the chaotic reality of frontier fighting. Specifically, he learned tactical lessons. 1. He learned to never fight in open ground surrounded by dense woods. The palynological analysis of the site centuries later scientifically validated this error, confirming the surrounding hillside was dense Appalachian oak forest, allowing the French to fire from concealed, elevated positions. 2. He realized that logistics and terrain mattered significantly more than just bravery. The profound logistical failure, where his men were hungry, exhausted, and their powder was soaked, underscored the need for reliable supply lines and superior site selection. 3. He recognized that the arrogance and rigid adherence to European doctrine by regular British officers could be deadly. These hard-earned lessons directly shaped Washington's strategies during the later Revolutionary War. His experience fueled his future obsession with supply, training, and setting up strong defensive positions. Moreover, he learned to be magnanimous in victory, having personally experienced the bitterness of defeat and the chaos that follows surrender. He would go on to have a productive military career during the remainder of the French and Indian War, observing British tactics and ultimately influencing the decision to elect him as the first president of the newly formed United States. The site of Washington's humiliation today is the Fort Necessity National Battlefield, preserved by the National Park Service. The restoration efforts, using advanced scientific methods like palynology, the study of ancient pollen grains, found in soil cores, have accurately reconstructed the historic landscape to visually confirm the fatal tactical vulnerability of the wet meadow where Washington was trapped. This modern stewardship ensures that visitors can visualize the precarious and exposed position that served as the crucible for the future commander-in-chief. The battle that started empires burning ultimately, Fort Necessity, was a compound failure, a muddy bowl of doom. But the chain reaction from that 15-minute skirmish at Jumonville Glen and the diplomatic catastrophe of the surrender provided the justification needed to launch the 7 Years' War. That global war led to the collapse of French power in North America. The massive costs of that victory, however, drove Britain to tax the colonies heavily, indirectly sowing the seeds for the American Revolution. In a muddy meadow in the Ohio wilderness, the world changed. And George Washington's first defeat became the opening chapter of his rise to greatness.